Tonight, I want to continue on this topic. Of course, in the last few hours, we've now had word of the potential for some ground operations now occurring in Gaza. And this is addressed to those who are watching in Florida or will watch this message in Florida about what's happening. I know the world's become a messy place over the last few hours. We have an incident that occurred over the skies of Ukraine with a Malaysian aircraft, and we don't know all the details of what occurred there. We should reserve judgment until we do, but suffice it to say that that may further complicate our view of the world in this chamber over the next few weeks. But let me address for a moment what's happening in the Middle East. And when I was elected to the Senate, about a few days later, the first trip I took was to Israel. It was a country I had long admired, that has strong links to the United States and to Florida in particular. In fact, the current Israeli ambassador to the United States is from Florida. His brother was the mayor of Miami Beach. And so there are strong links between Florida and Israel. And I was amazed on that trip by how far that country has come, a nation that doesn't really have oil or the kind of massive resources from an energy perspective that other countries in the region do, yet a country that is flourishing because of their investment in technology and innovation. There's a book called Startup Nation that chronicles the amazing miracle of Israel and what they've achieved. But the one thing that strikes you about Israel as you fly over it is how narrow it is. At its narrowest point, it's only 9 miles wide. This is a country that was forged, by the way, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, with the notion that never again will the Jewish people not have a place to go in the world to call their own. And that still remains the guiding principle behind the country and behind its defense forces. And we should view it within that context as we view what's occurring now in that region and part of the world. Literally, Israel is surrounded by enemies. Now, certainly they've had the stability in the last 2 decades of peace agreements with Jordan and Egypt. But look everywhere around Israel, and you see them surrounded by people who are intent on their destruction. We know that that's the case in Gaza. We know that that's the case in Samaria and Judea, or what's commonly called the West Bank by some. We know that that's the case with Assad in Syria and many of the elements fighting within Syria. We know that's the case with Hezbollah in Lebanon. We know that that's the case with Iran and its weapons programs and its long-term ambitions. This is a country surrounded by elements that want to destroy it. It is in that context, by the way, that this government in Israel was involved in an intensive process of negotiation, brokered and led by the U.S. with the Palestinian President Abbas regarding a potential peace deal. Some way of forging a solution, an answer to the conundrum of what to do with Palestinian populations that would allow them to live peacefully, coexist side by side with a Jewish state. And they entered into this conversation despite the fact that it was never clear that Abbas was able or had the power or the influence to make the sort of tough decisions that are going to be required for peace. In fact, they entered into this negotiation knowing that he may not even speak for all Palestinians, given the fact that Hamas controls the Gaza Strip. They entered into this negotiation nonetheless. They entered into this negotiation despite the chaos surrounding them in Lebanon and in Syria, despite the fact that Iran continues to pursue nuclear weapons to destroy Israel potentially. They entered into these negotiations because I say this to you unequivocally, I know of no nation on earth that wants peace more than Israel does. So they entered into these negotiations. And what happened? What happened is what always happens with these negotiations. What happened is Abbas eventually withdrew. He once again took himself out of the talks. And he tried once again to seek membership, Palestinian membership, into all these sort of international organisms as a state, as a country of its own, knowing that that was a deal breaker, knowing that if that occurred, there could be no peace negotiation. That's the route he chose nonetheless. But then he did what I believe has triggered this latest round of violence against Israel. And that is he decided to form a power-sharing government with a terrorist group by the name of Hamas that to this day continues to deny Israel's right to even exist. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment. How could you possibly ever enter into a peace agreement with an organization whose very purpose is your destruction? And yet that's what Israel was being asked to do. Well, tragically, within several weeks of that new government being formed, 3 teenagers, including an American citizen, were kidnapped and they were murdered. And then on July 7th, Hamas once again started raining down rockets on Israel. To date, more than 1,300 of them have been fired. The good news is that Israel has invested heavily in an air defense system, which I was able to see during my second visit to Israel in the early part of 2013. But 1,300 rockets is an extraordinary number. And that's what Israel's been facing. Now, as American policymakers, you ask, well, what is our interest in this? And I think it begins with a unique relationship that exists between the United States and Israel. It is the only vibrant democracy in that part of the world. Its alliance to the United States is unquestionable. Not just in international forums, but all over this planet, Israel is consistently on America's side time and again. And every one of our challenges, the cooperation between our countries are extraordinary. Not to mention that Israel as a nation stands for everything that we as a nation believe in: freedom, the ability to speak out. They have a vibrant democratic process. Anyone who's familiar with Israeli politics knows how vibrant their democracy is and how much they engage in open and public debate and bringing their governments together to govern the country. And so we have this extraordinary alliance with Israel of incredible importance. And that's why we care. That's the political reason. There's a moral reason behind it. And that is the right of the Jewish people to have a country that they can live in peacefully. That truly never again will we face a time when Jews have nowhere to go. And this is the commitment that we've made to Israel and that we must keep. And I must say that I am and have been deeply troubled at the attitude that this administration has adopted towards Israel. Let me be clear, I don't come here today to create this into a partisan issue. I don't want it to be a partisan issue. In fact, one of the great successes of American foreign policy towards Israel has been the strong bipartisan support that Israel enjoys in the House and the Senate for almost every American president since Israel's founding at the conclusion of World War II. But I am concerned about the position this administration has taken. I was concerned about the amount of pressure that the Secretary of State was placing on the Israelis to enter into a negotiation with the Palestinian Authority that didn't have the authority or the power to reach a peace agreement that they could possibly enforce, much less deliver on. I was concerned that that pressure was being put on them at a time when Israel faced so many other challenges, the number one being the ambitions that Iran has to acquire a nuclear weapon and long-range rockets that could strike Israel and eventually the mainland of the United States. And I think it's safe to say that the relationship between the Israeli government has never been worse towards an American president for more than 2 decades. And that has an impact on this region. And I think, unfortunately, it's had an impact here. I've also been concerned, by the way, by some of this moral equivalence that's going on in both the press and some of the emails that I'm getting and some of the public statements I'm hearing some make in some quarters, not here in the Senate, but in some other places. This idea that, well, both sides are to blame. That's an interesting concept, but it isn't true. It is tragic, unfortunately, that civilians are dying in Gaza. But the reason why civilians are dying is 100% Hamas's fault. You see, this is an organization that puts rockets and military installations right next to nurseries and hospitals and civilian population centers. And you know why they do that? You know why they do that? They do that because they know that when they launch a rocket, Israel will respond by hitting that rocket launcher. And when that rocket launcher is destroyed, so are the areas around it. And then they can get the cameras to go in there and say, look what Israel did. They wiped out a nursery or an apartment building. They do it on purpose. They know exactly what they are doing. They're doing so they can get the kind of coverage that, unfortunately, even some American press outlets are buying into now. Here's the bottom line, and Senator Graham was alluding to this a moment ago. Before, Israel does extraordinary things with regards to this. They drop leaflets into population centers warning, we're going to have to conduct a military operation in your region. Please evacuate. Please go somewhere else where you'll be safe. Hamas doesn't do that. In fact, Hamas deliberately targets population centers to terrorize the people of Israel. And we should condemn it for what it is. There is no moral equivalence here. And so now the situation has continued to spiral out of control. And it's reached a point where the news today now is that Israel's begun to conduct some ground operations. And these ground operations that they're conducting has to do with a tunnel network in Gaza that, as early as this morning, was used by Hamas to try to infiltrate terrorists through those tunnels into Israel, to conduct terrorist activity and kill Israelis. So put yourself in the position of this country, small and geographically isolated, surrounded by terrorist groups and some unfriendly countries, threatened by the prospect of an Iranian nuclear weapon, and being hit by 1,300 rockets in just the last week. They have no choice but to defend themselves, using all the power at their disposal. They have no choice. And not only should no one here be criticizing that, but we should be supporting it and aligning ourselves 100% on their side. Because what they are fighting for here, this is not some dispute over borders. This is not some geopolitical dispute about who owns what territory. Israel is fighting for their very survival. On the other side of this conflict is a terrorist organization bent on their destruction. On the other side of this conflict is a terrorist organization in Hamas, and truth be told, the Palestinian Authority, that's whose schools teach children not just to hate Israel, but to hate Jews. And how could you possibly say you are for peace when your schools are actively teaching your children to hate another people? That's what's on the other side of this conflict. And so Israel has no choice. They are fighting for their very survival. And I think that now more than ever, what they need from this country is a president and a U.S. government that aligns itself squarely on their side. No double talk, no fancy diplomatic language that you can read between the lines on. A very clear statement. In this conflict, we are on Israel's side, and we will support them with anything they need to ensure their stability and their survival. Very clear language that makes it unequivocally clear. Hamas is a terrorist organization, not a legitimate representative of the aspirations of the Palestinian people, but a terrorist organization designed for the very purpose of destroying the Jewish state. We need to make these things abundantly clear, because otherwise we're going to see more of this in the years to come. If there is any daylight between the United States and Israel, it emboldens Israel's enemies. Now, I would say, as bad as this situation is, and it is terrible, the biggest danger facing Israel today is not just the 1,300 rockets that have come over from Hamas. It is the threat of a nuclear Iran. And it is interesting that while we are having this conversation here today about the attack that Israel is under, this administration is trying to get an extension of these talks with the Iranian regime. I hope we clearly understand, I've said this before, I want to come here and reiterate, if Iran is allowed to retain the capability of enriching uranium or reprocessing plutonium, they will build a nuclear weapon with that capacity. If you let them, let me put it in plain English, if you let them keep the machines that you use to reprocess and enrich, they may not reprocess and enrich to weapons grade right away, but the fact they have the ability to do it, I guarantee you, eventually means that they will. And you know how I know that? Well, one, because all you have to do is hear the speeches that they give. But the second reason why we know that is because the other thing no one's talking about is Iran isn't just spinning centrifuges. They're not just enriching uranium and reprocessing plutonium. Iran is building rockets, long-range rockets, intercontinental missiles. And there's only one purpose for those missiles. And the only purpose that they have is to put a warhead on them with a nuclear payload. That is the only reason why you build missiles like that. You don't build missiles like that to deliver a conventional weapon. They are built for purposes of a nuclear capability. And I want you guys to know one more thing. These rockets that they want to build, these aren't just rockets that can reach Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. These are rockets that can reach Washington, D.C., and my hometown of Miami, and New York City, and the mainland of the United States. And so if they build these missiles with that range, and they develop the ability to enrich and reprocess, they're one step away, a half step away from becoming a nuclear power, able to hold our country hostage and to carry out their ambitions of destroying Israel. And that is the single greatest threat. As great as this threat is of Hamas, and it needs to be dealt with, and dealt with decisively, that is the single greatest security threat facing Israel. And it is ironic to me that even as we're focused on this issue and what's happening, this administration is off in Geneva trying to cut a deal with Iran that allows them to retain an acknowledged right to enrich and reprocess. And that's going to prove to be disastrous. It's my opinion those negotiations will lead to nothing, because Iran has entered these negotiations believing that they enter it from a position of strength. They believe that this president so badly wants a deal that they don't have to give on anything. And by the way, I don't know how you do a meaningful deal with Iran on nuclear weapons that doesn't involve a conversation about these long-range rockets. And yet that's exactly what they're doing, with little to no consultation with the Senate or any other policymakers. So I just came to the floor to reiterate not just my personal support for the state of Israel, but to reiterate how strongly I believe virtually every member of this body supports the state of Israel, supports Israel's right to defend itself, supports the United States alliance with Israel, supports doing everything we must and can do to help Israel defend herself. I think that's an important message to send out. And the last thing I would say is I would ask those who have watched the speech or who will hear these words later to take time over the next few days and pray for Israel. It needs our support there as well, that God will provide her the safety and security of her people now and in the years to come.